You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's April 30th, 1889 in New York City. It's Centennial Day, the 100th anniversary of President George Washington's first inauguration. President Benjamin Harrison, the Centennial President, rides in an open carriage from St. Paul's Chapel on Broadway to the Federal Sub-Treasury Building on Wall Street. But instead of enjoying the cheering crowds, Harrison is frustrated. He just attended a church service to honor President Washington, but the main speaker, Bishop Henry Potter, filled his sermon with thinly veiled criticisms of Harrison. He sat in silence during the sermon, but now in the carriage, Harrison vents to his secretary, Elijah Halford. What sort of bishop uses a sermon as an occasion for a political attack? I can't imagine, sir. Potter implied I use favoritism to run the country, called my administration a huge machine existing mainly for the purpose of rewarding partisan service. Those were his exact words. I know, sir. He romanticized the past at the expense of the factual historical record. I just hope the public will realize that if he were knowledgeable, he would find abundant reason not for praising the past at the expense of the present, but rather thankfulness that the past is past, never to return. The people revere you, sir. Look how many have come to see you live in the flesh. Harrison is stewing as he looks outside the carriage, but life in the public eye dictates he tempers his emotions. So he puts on a smile and waves to the crowd. And where are we going now? The literary exercises at the Federal Treasury. There will be an orator reading a few poems, and then you will give your remarks. Well, I'll use the occasion to set the record straight. I do sometimes feel like a hunted animal, as my walks and drives, even my meals, are often taken with those who are wanting something. As the carriage arrives at the Federal Building, 10,000 people watch President Harrison take his seat on the portico, along with Halford and dozens of politicians. The program begins promptly at 10. An orator reads a tribute to Washington, then President Harrison stands. He looks at the bronze statue of Washington standing near him and addresses the crowd. We have come into the serious but always inspiring presence of Washington. He was the incarnation of duty, and he teaches us today this great lesson. Those who would associate their names with events that shall outlive a century can only do so by high consecration to duty. Self-seeking has no public observance or anniversary. Halford nods as Harrison speaks. The man sitting next to him leans over and whispers, It seems the president means to defend himself. Yes, it seems so. Harrison is not a practical politician who calls in favors for selfish purposes, and now the public knows it. As the president continues his speech, he takes on a more patriotic tone. Looking at the flags waving and the bunting adorned the nearby post office building, the usually austere president gets emotional. The eye of the young and the old should look upon that flag as one of the familiar glories of every American. It is the thoughts that are in our hearts, born of the inspiration which comes with the story of the flag, of martyrs to liberty. Harrison takes his seat as the crowd applauds and waves miniature flags. The centennial celebrations continue throughout the day. A military parade, concerts, fireworks, and a banquet fill the afternoon and evening. Harrison's actions and attendance boost his popularity. Through speeches and smiles, Harrison further softens his reputation as a human iceberg. The president will need all that public support to make it through the deadly dramas that lie ahead. Wicked Game is sponsored by Factor. You know that nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old? Well, the first thing you need to know is that peas porridge was a real thing. Second, it's spelled P-E-A-S-E, a Middle English plural noun like flour, but made from legumes like peas. Third, it was the ultimate in medieval convenience food. Boil up anything you had in a single pot until you get a viscous slime, eat what you can stand, then just keep eating. Hot or cold, throwing in more stuff as you go. 9 days old may not be an exaggeration. So convenient, but not tasty, and maybe even rancid. These days, we are so much better off with Factor. Same convenience, much more taste, and a lot less gross. Factor is America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit. Chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door with over 35 different options a week to choose from, including keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, and more. And there's even more to enjoy with 55 nutrition-packed add-ons that help make your weekly meal planning even more delicious and certainly better than throwing whatever you can scrounge into a pot. Head to factormeals.com/wickedgame50 and use code wickedgame50 to get 50% off. That's code wickedgame50 at factormeals.com/wickedgame50 to get 50% off. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? It could come at any time, in the morning, midday, in the evening. You could sleep in. You could actually take a lunch. You could go on an evening walk. I'd like to say I'd take a nap or read a book, but knowing me, I'd probably end up working because there's always work to do, right? A lot of us wish we had more time. But time for what? Do you know what's important to you? How to make it a priority? Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. And if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/elections. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. In 1889, Benjamin Harrison became the Centennial President, inaugurated exactly 100 years after George Washington. But across his term, he faced serious domestic and international crises, a standoff with Sioux Indians at Wounded Knee, and conflicts with Germany and Chile that nearly sparked wars. Harrison met each challenge head-on while trying to stay focused on his main agenda, a protectionist tariff. In his bid for re-election in 1892, Harrison found himself going up against not one, but two strong candidates. For the third time, the Democrats would nominate former President Grover Cleveland. The Populist Party, a third party formed to champion issues important to poor laborers and farmers, would run an Ohio congressman named James Weaver. Weaver would campaign mainly on a single issue, the unlimited coinage of silver. Former President Cleveland would advocate for the gold standard and a lower tariff, while Harrison would preach the Republican gospel of protectionism. The three-way race would be eerily similar to the 1888 contest, with tariffs taking center stage. In order for Cleveland to prevail, he would need to win over voters in key swing states and convince the populace to vote for him. But a tragic death mere weeks before Election Day would bring all three campaigns to a screeching halt. This is episode 27, 1892, Harrison versus Cleveland, the Centennial President. It's December 15th, 1890, near Fort Yates, North Dakota. 43 Native American police officers surround a small wooden cabin in the early dawn. They are here to arrest Hunkpapa Lakota leader Sitting Bull. U.S. Army General Nelson Miles, stationed in Chicago, has ordered the arrest of dozens of Native American leaders accused of fomenting rebellion through a religious movement called the Ghost Dance. The Army asked Indian police officers near Fort Yates to quietly take Sitting Bull into custody, hoping to avoid upsetting Sitting Bull's followers. A police lieutenant knocks on the cabin door. Well, there's no answer. I'll go in. You all wait here. The lieutenant enters the cabin alone and finds Sitting Bull asleep on his floor. He roughly wakes the slumbering man, who startles. What's going on? Can't simply walk in my house. What do you want with me? Get up, old man. I have orders to take you into custody. Sitting Bull sighs and sits up. He looks behind Bullhead and sees the policeman waiting outside his door. He knows resistance is futile. All right, let me put on my clothes and I'll go with you. Please have my horse saddled while I dress and gather my things. As Bullhead's men prepare a horse, Sitting Bull takes his time getting dressed and filling a bag with food. He then allows Bullhead to escort him out of the house. But upon exiting, Bullhead finds over 100 angry ghost dancers standing behind his police officers. He calls out to the throng. Now, there's no need to worry. I'm escorting Sitting Bull to the agency headquarters at Standing Rock. You can all go home. But Sitting Bull's people don't move. One of the ghost dancers, named Catch the Bear, steps forward. You think you are going to take him, but you shall not do it. Bullhead ignores the angry man. He whispers to Sitting Bull. Come now, don't listen to them. But Sitting Bull sees this as his chance to avoid arrest. No, I don't believe I'm going anywhere. As the lieutenant and one of his men, a young sergeant, drag Sitting Bull toward his horse, Catch the Bear throws off his blanket and shoulders a rifle. Before the police can stop him, Catch the Bear fires. The lieutenant screams and falls to the ground, where he draws his revolver and returns fire. But his aim is off. The lieutenant's bullet, meant for Catch the Bear, hits Sitting Bull. His sergeant panics. Simultaneous to the lieutenant's shot, he also draws his weapon. But the sergeant doesn't fire at the ghost dancers. He aims for Sitting Bull and shoots him in the head. These two shots grew to a full firefight. The police killed 7 of Sitting Bull's Hunkapapa Lakota followers. They, in turn, killed 8 police officers, including the wounded police lieutenant. Instead of remaining a quiet affair, Sitting Bull's arrest and assassination became a widely publicized event. The death of Sitting Bull only escalated tensions between Lakota Indians and the Ghost Dance movement, and the soldiers trying to control them. In the late 1880s, the Ghost Dance movement had swept through many Native American tribes. The leader of the religious movement, Paiute shaman Wovoka, had preached that Native Americans should give up drinking, live a simple life, and pray. He had promised that white men would disappear and deceased Indians would rejoin the living. Believers practiced days of worship and a ritual known as the Ghost Dance. The Lakota Sioux Indians in the Dakotas had adopted these practices. The Lakota had suffered significant injustices since the passage of the 1887 Dawes Severalty Act. This act had promised to give every Indian family in the area 160 acres to farm so they could become, as President Harrison explained, self-supporting and responsible citizens. But there were quickly reports of natives being cheated in land deals and denied government food rations. These reports reached Harrison in mid-1890, and he ordered a full investigation. The results came a few months later. The report outlined that the unrest among Native Americans was justified, stating, "Those guilty of actual deeds of hostility should be punished, but the great mass of them have a right to expect sympathy, help, and last but by no means least, justice." While Harrison digested this message, the ghost dancers in the Dakotas had grown more passionate. This had scared the Indian agent at the Pine Ridge Reservation. The inexperienced man had sent a panicky telegram to Washington which said, "Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. We need protection, and we need it now." The Army sent approximately 600 troops to help control the situation. But in December of 1890, a former Indian agent, Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy, visited the reservation and saw nothing to cause alarm. "I should let the dance continue," he surmised. "The coming of the troops has frightened the Indians. If the Seventh-day Adventists prepare their ascension robes for the second coming of the Savior, the United States Army is not put into motion to prevent them. Why should not the Indians have the same privilege? If the troops remain, trouble is sure to come." Dr. McGillicuddy was right. On December 17th, only 2 days after the death of Sitting Bull, a few hundred leaderless Hunkpapa Lakota Indians headed south for safety at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. They joined about 100 people following Minneconjou Lakota chief Spotted Elk, also traveling south. The large group traveled slowly. Chief Spotted Elk developed pneumonia and had to travel in a wagon, slowing the group even more. On December 28th, the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Army intercepted the group 40 miles from the reservation. The Army took the Lakotas to the cavalry camp near Wounded Knee Creek. The next morning, Colonel James Forsyth called the Lakota leaders, including Chief Spotted Elk, to a meeting. Approximately 120 Lakota men sat in a semicircle facing the Army officers. The men gathered between the cavalry camp to the north and the Lakota camp to the south. Colonel Forsyth began the meeting without preamble. He told the Lakota to surrender all their weapons. The Lakota turned to Chief Spotted Elk to give their answer. He nodded his head, and all of the men placed their guns in a pile in front of the soldiers. The soldiers looked at the pitiful arsenal of a few dozen guns in disbelief. Forsyth thought the Indians were hiding the rest of their weapons. He commanded his soldiers to search the tents. Lakota Indian Dog Chief recounted, "They would go right into the tents and come out with bundles and tear them open. They brought our axes, knives, and tent stakes and piled them near the guns." Throughout this search and seizure, Chief Spotted Elk and his men sat in silence. Then the soldiers ordered the Lakota men to remove their blankets and be searched themselves. Black Coyote, a deaf Lakota, did so. The soldier saw that he still had his gun. He hadn't understood the previous order to relinquish his weapon. Several soldiers tried to take the gun from Black Coyote. One Lakota man recalled, if they had left him alone, he was going to put his gun down where he should, but they grabbed him and spinned him in the east direction. He hadn't pointed his gun at anyone. His intention was to put that gun in the pile. In the scuffle between the deaf Lakota and the soldiers, the gun went off. Soldiers panicked and opened fire on the unarmed men. The men, women, and children still in the tents began running into the ravine south of their camp. A few Lakota men and women scrounged for guns to defend themselves, but they were no match for the cavalry's rifles and Hotchkiss guns. A soldier positioned on the south side of the ravine watched the terrified Lakotas running for their lives and reported, "Soon after the firing began, a number of Indians from the village came up across the ravine onto the plateau. I here opened fire on the Indians who have crossed the ravine, who were attempting to escape. As soon as I forced them back or cleaned them out, I saw some going up the ravine. I cut off about 12 men and covered that ravine to prevent their escape by that line." After a few hours, the firing ceased. At least 150 Lakota men, women, and children lay dead in the snow. Unable to run due to his illness, Chief Spotted Elk was cut down where he sat. 25 U.S. Army soldiers also died, many from friendly fire. Though some soldiers would later claim that they killed the Lakotas in self-defense, an investigation into the massacre told a different story. Investigators found the bodies of a woman and 3 children, aged about 5, 7, and 10. They were unarmed, lying beneath a leafless shrub, and their clothes and flesh had burn marks from the close range of the shots that killed them. In spite of this grisly evidence, the investigators did not find fault with the 7th Cavalry. The official report attributed the high number of Lakota women and children killed to the fact that they were intermingled with the Lakota men. President Harrison cleared Colonel Forsyth of any wrongdoing. He stated, "I take great gratification that the incident has been closed so speedily, though the affair at Wounded Knee was a very bloody one." In the face of the massacre at Wounded Knee, President Harrison did not change his position towards Native Americans. He continued to promote assimilation as the only way forward for the Lakota and all Native American tribes. Harrison met with a delegation of Sioux leaders and counseled them, "Endeavor the best you can to earn your living. Every white man works for the bread and meat that sustains him, and you must learn to do a little more for your own support every year." But the tragic and deadly event at Wounded Knee exposed a dark political reality in 1890s America. The murder of unarmed men, women, and children by the U.S. Army was not a political scandal, and Harrison sweeping it under the rug did not cost him in the upcoming campaign. For most in the country, the assimilation policy toward Native Americans was an unquestioned necessity. Most Americans were concerned with their own livelihood. The tragic reality was that for most Americans in the Gilded Age, the economy trumped issues of social justice. And as president, Harrison would capitalize on this sentiment and push a political agenda that would position him well for re-election in the 1892 contest. On President Harrison's agenda was increasing veteran pensions, regulating business monopolies, and creating voting regulations to protect black voting rights in the South. Republicans in Congress fell behind him. In 1890, Congress passed the Dependent Pension Act, a watershed government welfare act that gave federal aid not only to Civil War veterans, but also to their children. Additionally, Senator John Sherman, General William Tecumseh Sherman's brother, introduced a bill that outlawed trusts, monopolies, and cartels to increase economic competitiveness. But congressional progress soon went off the rails over black voting rights in the South. Old tensions surrounding civil rights came to a boiling point when Republicans introduced the Lodge Elections Bill. Southern Democrats dubbed it a force bill and colluded with Western Republican representatives to kill it. Westerners wanted unlimited silver coinage. They promised to vote against the Lodge Bill in exchange for Democratic support of their pro-silver legislation, and it worked. The Lodge Bill never made it out of the Senate. Colorado Senator Edward Walcott commented, "There are many things more important and vital to the welfare of this nation than that the colored citizens of the South shall vote." Most Americans agreed. So just as he had with the massacre at Wounded Knee, Harrison dropped protecting minority rights in favor of more popular political issues. Though the president had supported the Lodge Bill, he was quick to abandon it. Instead, he looked to the 1892 election and focused on an issue that he was confident would garner political points: the tariff. Harrison lobbied for a high protectionist tariff. In 1890, he had signed the McKinley Tariff Act. The bill raised import duties only about 11% and actually eliminated duties on a few key items like sugar. But the Tariff Act gave Harrison executive authority to reinstate those tariffs at any time, and he used that power as a threat when negotiating trade deals with other countries. And Harrison would face thorny situations with France, Great Britain, and Germany. But his biggest challenges would not happen in dark rooms working out trade agreements, but rather they would involve the United States' burgeoning naval force and a political revolution in South America that would push the country to the brink of war. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. 2024 is going to be a watershed year for my business. We've hired up, made ambitious plans, and that means, yes, new podcasts. But also, we crossed a point of complexity that's made it more important than ever to know our numbers. Because if you don't know your numbers, you don't know your business. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, all into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessible from anywhere. You'll cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite, and you improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math and see how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. Now through April 15th, NetSuite is offering a one-of-a-kind flexible financing program. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections. netsuite.com/elections. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. Within his first month in office, Harrison had inherited an escalating international crisis in Samoa. In the 1880s, Germany, Great Britain, and the United States had established naval bases and coal rights in Samoa. Apia Harbor had served as a crucial refueling station for their coal-fueled steamships. And after a few years, Germany had attempted to wrest control of the port from Great Britain and the U.S. Then, in 1887, Germany had encouraged a revolt against the Samoan king and tried to establish a puppet ruler. In response to this foreign interference, rebels led an attack on German forces. In late 1880, these rebels killed at least 20 German troops and wounded another 30. Germany threatened all-out war with the rebel Samoans and any American or British soldiers who might support them. In a show of strength, lame duck President Grover Cleveland had sent 3 American ships to Apia as a warning to Germany. Cleveland's threat had worked. The German government requested a conference with the U.S. and Great Britain. After his March 4, 1889 inauguration, President Harrison sent delegates to a meeting with European powers. While the diplomats traveled to Berlin, German, American, and British sailors in Apia Harbor had continued to spar with one another. The conflict reached its apex when a massive tropical cyclone hit. On March 15, 1889, the storm ripped into Apia Harbor. The naval ships, 3 German, 3 American, and 1 British, should have sailed out to sea to ride out the storm, but no one had wanted to yield the harbor to the other party. So they had stayed anchored in the harbor. This display of jingoism came at a deadly price. The storm destroyed or damaged all of the ships. 50 American and 90 German sailors died. This tragic loss of life cast a shadow over the diplomatic proceedings in Berlin. The sober delegates worked quickly to resolve their differences, and by June 1889, the 3 nations had agreed to restore the Samoan king to his throne and establish a 3-power protectorate. This treaty, and Harrison's role in it, had continued the U.S. on its imperialistic path. The president declared that the United States had entered a new epoch of international influence. Harrison also worked to bolster trade with other countries, protecting American interests and labor in the process. He wanted to leave a legacy of American prestige abroad, and closer to home, Harrison wanted to keep his place in the White House come 1892. To do both, Harrison strengthened and expanded the American Navy, and in early 1891, the president would get a chance to display his Navy's strength. In January 1891, revolution broke out in the country of Chile. During the uprising, the U.S. minister to Chile asked for American naval support to protect American interests. President Harrison asked Navy Secretary Benjamin Tracy to advise him. They sent several U.S. Navy ships to patrol Chilean waters and intimidate. The impressive USS Baltimore sailed into Valparaiso, Chile, and had the desired effect. One naval officer telegraphed Secretary Tracy that the arrival of the Baltimore on this station has attracted a great deal of attention and has also had a very good effect in increasing the respect of these people for our Navy and showing them that the United States had the power to protect the interests of her citizens. Imperial European powers also took notice of American actions in Chile. Though a relatively small country, Chile had a thriving economy, and countries like Britain and France did a lot of business there. They kept a close eye on the outcome of the Chilean Revolution and America's involvement in it. But when the revolution ended, an incident between U.S. sailors and Chileans got the whole world's attention. It's October 16, 1891. A balmy spring breeze blows through the port city of Valparaiso, Chile. Several American sailors from the USS Baltimore saunter around Valparaiso streets. Though the revolution is over and American interests are secure, the Baltimore and her crew are still stationed in the Chilean port. Today, Captain Slay has given his 117 crew members a rare shore leave. 2 crew members, John Talbot and Charles Riggin, intend to make the most of it. Talbot and Riggin, along with a dozen other sailors, walk into a saloon and dance hall called the Shakespeare. The proprietor does not welcome them. I'm closing up. Why? It's early. We've got gold in our pockets. I don't want your money. There's talk that the town roughs mean to tackle you fellows tonight, and I don't want any trouble in my saloon. Now get out. The sailors do as they're told, but aren't worried about the rumors. They're confident they can take on any Chilean street gang. At 3:30 p.m., Talbot and Riggin head into another saloon, the True Blue, meet up with a few more sailors. Talbot notices the pretty bartender. How about this, boys? A nice day, a good beer, and better scenery than I've had in weeks. Talbot's shipmates laugh. He orders another round for his friends just to get a chance to talk to the bartender. The men drink for nearly an hour when Talbot and Riggins decide to head for a better part of town. All right, I've had enough of this lower quarter. Let's take a streetcar and see what else this town has to offer. I'll join you. Just give me a chance to talk to her one more time. While Talbot chats with a young woman, Riggins exits the bar. He notices the streets are empty, and a rough-looking man approaches him. I don't want any trouble. Well, I do. We don't need any more Americans around here. Go home, Yankee. Just then, Talbot exits the saloon. He sees the worried look on Riggins' face. Hey, what's the trouble here? This man wants to start a row with me. I've told him I was just leaving. Talbot pushes his way in between his friend and the Chilean. Hey, shove off. We've got plenty more friends than you nearby. But the man doesn't back down. He spits in Talbot's face and punches him hard in the gut. Talbot falls to the ground. We'll see who has more friends. And in moments, the street is full of Chilean sailors ready to fight. Talbot and Riggin decide to run for it. They dash down the Ye de Arsenal and hide in an empty streetcar. The gang soon catches up. A few of them have drawn knives. Soon, the two Americans are fighting for their lives, while their friends hear the fighting and come to their aid. The brawl lasted over an hour before armed police broke it up. 18 American sailors and 1 Chilean were wounded. Reagan was stabbed, shot, and died hours later. The sailors returned to the USS Baltimore and did not take another shore leave. But the international debacle was just beginning. President Harrison and Navy Secretary Tracy wanted Chile to apologize for this incident. They also demanded that Chile pay reparations to the injured sailors. This posturing sent a clear message that Americans wouldn't be cowed. Harrison hoped to demonstrate U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere and gain equal footing with imperial European nations. Americans had the navy and manpower to do it. A small nation like Chile couldn't be seen as getting the better of the United States. But Chile did not apologize. While economically strong, Chile was not politically strong or organized. It had just gone through a difficult and deadly revolution. The Americans' impatient demand for an apology smacked of bullying. German statesman Otto von Bismarck was surprised that a nation as powerful as the American Union did not show more moderation and respect for a nation as small as Chile, that had just come out of a civil war, and insisted in imposing on it the same qualities that they condemned in the riot. But European sympathy did not extend to offers of military backing should war break out between Chile and the U.S. Europeans had noticed growing American clout in the Pacific and were not interested in entering into a conflict. Another German diplomat told his Chilean counterpart that since the U.S. was seeking the pretext for a war, the Chileans would have to be careful not to give one. The Chilean foreign minister recognized that Chile didn't have reason to claim culpability for the brawl, which had come to be known as the Baltimore Affair. But he also recognized that a street fight wasn't a reason to go to war. So in early 1892, Chile issued a formal apology and paid $75,000 in gold to the sailors involved. President Harrison was relieved by the outcome, but he was exhausted from handling foreign affairs almost entirely alone. His Secretary of State Blaine was kept away from his duties by illness and family troubles, leaving Harrison implementing policy with very little input from his trusted advisor, and the situation in the cabinet wouldn't get better. As the Baltimore Affair ended, Secretary of State Blaine's third son died, and his fourth went through a nasty, highly public divorce. The strain was too much, and Blaine resigned in 1892, leaving the president to his own devices on foreign issues. President Harrison's desire for a stronger military helped many American businesses. Across his term, Harrison had contracted with American steel manufacturers to produce the sheet metal and bolts for building Navy ships. Demand for coal to power these ships had grown, and the military growth had also increased demand for shipping and railways. Across the country, business owners had seen increased profits, but their laborers had not. Workers fought hard for better conditions and pay. In 1892, a violent uprising of silver miners in Idaho prompted that state's governor to ask Washington, D.C. for military intervention. Railroad operators in New York walked off the job, demanding higher pay and safer conditions. In Tennessee, coal miners also demanded higher wages and fought against the use of cheap convict labor. Some workers joined unions to have their demands heard. And in July 1892, a strike at the Carnegie Steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, got the entire nation's attention. For 2 months, Andrew Carnegie's agent Henry Frick had been negotiating with the unionized workers. They demanded higher pay and shorter hours. But when the talks broke down at the end of June, Frick locked the workers out of the mill. They began a strike. Frick hired strikebreakers, but the strikers guarded the entrances and prevented Frick from running the mill. Frick brought in Pinkerton detectives to disperse the strikers. In the early hours of July 6th, a firefight broke out between the well-armed strikers and the Pinkerton agents. The 15-hour battle left at least 11 dead and dozens injured. But it was the violence of the strikers, beating Pinkertons as they attempt to escape and burning their ships to the waterline, that turned public opinion against the strikers and their labor cause. The following day, the Pennsylvania governor called in the state militia to break the strike. Within a few weeks, Frick reopened the mill. He didn't rehire any of the union workers, and then he paid his new labor force lower wages than he had before the strike. The ultimate failure of the union demonstrated how difficult it was for laborers to fight the combined will of a corporation and a government. And so laborers lost faith in Harrison and his desire to protect their interests. They realized it was time to create a political alliance of their own, one that would put their interests and concerns first. In 1892, the labor unrest coalesced into a powerful third party that would directly challenge President Harrison, the Populist Party. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War through the war itself and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com.
Gather round, friend, and join me by the fire. I have a secret to share. When I was a child, I lived with my grandma. She allowed me to watch unsolved mysteries. Fast forward to 2008, my freshman year of college. A series of armed robberies on campus escalated into a serial rapist's reign of terror. That's when I created my first crime podcast. In January 2014, I picked up the podcast again. From my college roommate who fell for an underage girl online, to the chilling story of a murdered nun in 1969 Baltimore, and in the Throwaway series, I share my own journey of overcoming homelessness and how that experience led me to unmask a serial killer and identify 3 of his Jane Doe victims. This is Foul Play Crime Series, where the stories are real and the truth is awaiting to be discovered.
There were a few politicians who wanted the government to work for the laborer. For years, the Farmers Alliance had advocated for economic actions to help farmers. They'd tried to work within the two-party system, but often found their liberal agenda sidelined. During Harrison's term, his imperialistic goals benefited American corporate interests, often at the expense of American labor. In February 1892, members of the Farmers Alliance and other groups had formed a new party focused on the welfare of working-class Americans. Party leader Ignatius L. Donnelly stated, "We seek to restore the government of the Republic to the hands of the plain people with whom it originated. The interests of rural and urban labor are the same. Their enemies are identical." Reporters covering the formation of this third party called it the Populist Party, and the name stuck. Delegates of the Populist Party had scheduled a convention for the 4th of July in Omaha, Nebraska. But before the Populists could nominate a candidate, the Republicans and Democrats went to work choosing nominees of their own. On June 7, 1892, the Republican convention opened in Minneapolis. Many Republicans went into the convention frustrated with Harrison. His international trade deals and diplomatic appointments were unpopular with a small faction of Republicans, and his policies had upset laborers and emptied the U.S. Treasury. This faction hoped to nominate former Secretary of State James Blaine. Rumors circulated that Blaine had resigned his Secretary of State post in order to prepare for a presidential run. He denied it, explaining that he was too ill to campaign or serve. Blaine's sister-in-law, Gail Hamilton, reported, "He has told everybody of his inability to run, and the reply has been that they would rather have him dead than anyone else alive." But at the convention on June 10th, Blaine received only a few nominating votes. Harrison won handily. While he had ruffled a few feathers, no other candidate had enough support to challenge the sitting president. Following Harrison's nomination for re-election, Republicans once again endorsed a platform for a high tariff, while also ignoring many other issues affecting everyday Americans. Later that month, on June 21st, the Democrats opened their convention in Chicago. They made history by nominating the same man for the 3rd time in a row, former President Grover Cleveland. Cleveland supported a lower tariff that benefited laborers. While the Democrats were willing to go to bat for American workers with a tariff, they too stayed silent on many other issues. Their platforms matched the Republican party's on almost every issue. Neither party wanted to alienate voters by addressing divisive issues like black voting rights, Native American assimilation, or services for impoverished Americans. The newly formed Populist Party, though, offered a radically different option. On July 4, 1892, the Populist Party adopted a platform that dealt with issues important to farmers and laborers. They called for federal regulation of railroad rates and warehouses to store surplus farm produce. They also advocated for a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, a shorter work week, and most importantly, the free and unlimited coinage of silver. These measures would check big corporate interests in favor of the little guy. The Populists nominated former Iowa Congressman James Weaver as their presidential candidate. He championed his party's liberal platform, but Weaver had a tough road ahead. He would have to campaign against 2 presidents. To help his chances, he took his campaign on the road. In mid-July, Weaver gave a speech in Des Moines, Iowa. He closed by saying this is going to be an exciting campaign and warned, let us not be carried away by passion. But Weaver got it wrong. The campaign was not exciting. Despite the significant issues that Harrison faced in his term, Native American rights, black voting rights, complex international situations, the 2 major candidates focused on the tariffs. Harrison defended the McKinley Act he had signed 2 years earlier. Cleveland argued against it, pointing out that the tariff in present conditions is unjust. It benefited business owners at the expense of their workers, and he pointed to the deadly Homestead strike in July of 1892 as proof that high Republican tariffs hurt laborers. He explained, ours is not a destructive party. We are not at enmity with the rights of any of our citizens. We are not recklessly heedless of any American interests, nor will we abandon our regard for them. Cleveland's stance on labor rights caught the attention of Democratic Party leaders, who realized they closely matched that of the Populist Party. They used this to their advantage. In many states, Democrats created an alliance with populists to hurt Republican prospects, but the Populist Party didn't welcome this incursion. Weaver launched an aggressive campaign tour of southern states. On September 17, 1892, the populist candidate gave a speech in Florida. He asserted, the majority of white voters are with the People's Party in every southern state. But Weaver overstated the issue. Most white voters stood with the Democrats and with Cleveland. The Populist Party's farmer-friendly platform just wasn't enough. The South remained firmly Democratic. Harrison knew this too. By the end of September, he gave up on the idea of winning any southern state. Meanwhile, Democrats worried about their prospects in the Midwest, where the Populists had a strong hold. Both major parties therefore turned their full attention to critical swing states, Indiana and New York. But just as Harrison, Cleveland, and Weaver geared up for the last leg of the campaign, tragedy struck. It's September 21st, 1892 in Washington, D.C. A horse-drawn ambulance pulls up to the White House. When it stops, a doctor and nurse emerge. They carefully remove a stretcher from the back of the carriage, carrying First Lady Carolyn Harrison, her skin nearly as white as the blanket covering her body. She coughs weakly. A small amount of blood splatters. President Harrison is the next to exit the ambulance and walks behind the doctor and nurse as they carry his wife into the house. A small crowd witnesses the pitiable scene. Oh, how sad the president looks. Yeah, did you see his face? I don't think he slept in weeks. I wonder how long she's been ill. The papers reported last week that she had tuberculosis. She's already so thin. She must have been sick for months. I wouldn't doubt it. The family probably kept it quiet so they could care for her. Ah, poor thing. She won't last long from the looks of it. The onlookers were right. President Harrison's 60-year-old wife had been sick with tuberculosis for nearly a year. The family traveled to the Adirondacks, hoping Carolyn Harrison would recover, but she didn't. Now at home in the White House, the First Lady is fading. Harrison spends every spare minute at her bedside. Family and close friends keep vigil when pressing campaign business pulls him away. But Harrison can't bring himself to care about his political career now. While watching over his wife, Harrison speaks with his personal secretary, Elijah Halford. I feel like a leader in prison. Oh, I can only imagine, sir. I don't want another term in office with its nagging annoyances. But I should feel chagrined if the people of the country turn away from my administration. Yes, sir. You've done marvelous work these last 4 years. Well, thank you, Halford. Would you consider making a few speeches, as you did in the previous campaign? It would be a powerful factor in this canvass. No, I could not. I would not think of leaving Carolyn now for anything. Please, leave me alone. President Harrison kept vigil over his wife for weeks. A few friends and allies kept his campaign alive, giving speeches on his behalf around the country, but Harrison didn't leave his wife's side. He waited for Election Day, almost hoping for a release from the presidential mantle. On October 25, 1892, First Lady Carolyn Harrison died and put the 1892 campaign on hold. Cleveland canceled many of his speaking engagements. Weaver followed suit. Harrison didn't make any more public appearances. He didn't even vote. But on Tuesday, November 8, 1892, most eligible American voters did. The U.S. had welcomed 6 new states since the last election: North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. Wyoming was interesting because its constitution gave all women full voting rights, the first state to do so, allowing women in the cowboy state to cast ballots nearly 30 years before all American women would be able to do so. Wyoming voted for Harrison, along with 14 other states. Weaver made a strong showing. He won 4 states and became the first third-party candidate to earn over 1 million votes. But Grover Cleveland garnered a plurality of the popular vote and a majority of electoral votes. Former Republican President Rutherford Hayes wrote in his diary, "The election is a landslide." He attributed the Democratic victory to the People's Party and the labor vote, which threw its votes in favor of change. President Harrison went home to Indianapolis, while Cleveland went back to the White House, fulfilling his wife's prophecy. In March 1889, Francis Cleveland had told a White House steward, "I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now. We are coming back, just 4 years from today." Grover Cleveland entered his second term ready to work with a Democratic majority in Congress to push for lower tariffs. But a looming national financial crisis threatened to stop the Democratic president in his tracks and bring the American economy to its knees. This is episode 27 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1892, the Centennial President. On the next episode, the election of 1896. In the wake of the greatest economic depression in the country's history, former Nebraska Congressman William Jennings Bryan emerges as the Democratic candidate, intent on using a cross of gold to get the best of an affable governor from Ohio, William McKinley. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details. And while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by C.L. Salazar. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.